Week we love our chats with Leith Van Onselen, Chief Economist at the MB Fund at MB Super, one of the key brains at macrobusiness.com.au. It's where we get our economic news each day. An excellent place to head, and Leith is on the line. Sorry to keep you waiting, mate. Thanks so much. I hope you're well.
Yeah, g'day, Luke. Yeah, I'm fine, thanks.
Good on you. Housing crisis. It continues to be a thing here. Obviously didn't affect the election result, but we've had population data I think, come through on Thursday. And I think there's a bit of, I don't want to say it's not fudging of the figures, but the government's got lucky here because more people are leaving Australia, from what I could see.
Yeah. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics released the official population data for the fourth quarter of 2024, and it showed that both immigration and population growth continue to ease back from their, post-pandemic extreme levels. So over the year, so this is 2024, Australia's population grew by about 446,000. So that's basically a Canberra. So we added a Canberra in 1 year, and that was driven by net overseas migration of about 341,000. Now, this is obviously down from about, 550 odd. So it's fallen, quite a lot net overseas migration. But just to keep it into perspective, before the pandemic hit, Australia's single biggest year for net overseas migration was just under 316,000 in 2008. So 341,000 still very high historically.
Yeah.
And, just to put some numbers around New South Wales and Queensland, so New South Wales grew by 108,000 last year, and that was driven almost 100% by net overseas migration of just under 107,000. So New South Wales lost about 28,000 people to other states, primarily because you've got expensive housing up there. And that loss of residents to other states basically offset your net births. Queensland grew by just under 103,000 last year, and that was driven by net overseas migration of about 57,000. You received about 26,000 from other states, and you had net births of about 20,000. So, population growth still remains very high, although it is coming down. Now, this is obviously, very good news if you're worried about the housing market, because if you've got less people coming in, it means less pressure on rents and house prices and that sort of stuff. And obviously, housing is incredibly expensive, both to purchase and rent at the moment. So, near historical record highs. Now, the federal budget's forecast that immigration is going to ease back to its pre-pandemic level by 2027, and it then forecasts that we're going to have 235,000 net overseas migration for the next 4 decades. Now, they'll come out and say, look, see, we've halved immigration. But the problem, Luke, is that 235,000 projected net overseas migration is still incredibly high, and it's going to ensure that Australia remains in a permanent housing crisis. And we only need to look at the last 20 years of data to show why that's the case. So Australia's population growth surged after the Big Australia policy came in 20 years ago. And Australia's net overseas migration more than doubled after 2005. So in the 60 years following World War II, Australia's net overseas migration averaged 90,000 per year. And there was only 2 of those years in that 60 years following World War II that we exceeded 150,000. And we didn't exceed it by much.
Yeah.
But in the last 20 years, and this includes the pandemic, Australia's net overseas migrations averaged 231,000. So that's a 156% increase on the 60-year average post-World War II. And as a result, Australia's population has grown by 8.7 million people this century, so since the year 2000.
Jeez.
That's 46% growth, and that is the strongest growth in the advanced world, right? This extreme population growth is why we have not been able to build enough housing or infrastructure. We've not kept up with demand, and as a result, we've got this housing crisis, across all the major cities, and declining livability in our major cities because we're not building enough infrastructure. Everything's getting more crush-loaded. Now, the problem is, Luke, the housing shortage, even though immigration's coming down and based on the budget forecast, it's still projected to worsen. So recently, AMP Chief Economist Shane Oliver estimated that Australia's current housing shortage is somewhere between 200 and 300,000 homes. And last month, the federal government's own advisory council, the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, released their latest State of the Housing Report, and it forecast that Australia's shortage is going to worsen by another 79,000 over the next 5 years. And what they did was they based their population forecast on the Treasury's own forecast.
Yeah.
So they just basically grabbed the Centre for Population's forecast, which is basically the budget and intergenerational report, etc. And then they worked out what's a realistic level of building. And they said, we're going to come up for 79,000 homes short in the next 5 years. So that means our cumulative housing shortage is going to increase from where it already is, somewhere between 200 and 300,000 by another 79,000. But here's the rub loop. The National Housing Supply and Affordability Council's own sensitivity analysis at the end of the report, they said that if we cut population growth by just 15%, or population growth is 15% less than what the government forecasts, instead of having a shortage of 79,000 homes over 5 years, we'd actually have a surplus of 40,000 homes.
That's cutting it by just 15%.
15%, mate. And what that tells you is that the primary solution, if you want to solve this mess, is to cut out net overseas migration, obviously. You bring less people in, you need less housing for them. But sadly, Luke, the federal government has no genuine intention to solve the housing crisis because it wants to keep running this Big Australia policy. And in fact, the Centre for Population's own projections, and these were released in December 2024, so they're, as current as we've got, that's run out of the Australian Treasury. They said that we're going to grow the population by 13.5 million people in the next 40 years. So to put that into perspective, and that follows obviously 8.7 million so far this century, but that is equivalent to adding another Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane to the current population. So think of all the houses and infrastructure and everything that are in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane right now. We'd have to replicate that in 40 years, right? It's not going to happen.
No.
And it took Australia 185 years to reach a population of 13.5 million in 1973. Yet we're supposed to add that same amount in just 40 years. So, this just proves that the primary solution to the housing crisis is to merely cut immigration back to pre-2005 historical levels that we had in the 60 years post-World War II. And if we did that, we would be able to catch up on supply of both housing and infrastructure, and we'd have, more livable cities and I'd argue also a better economy, a more diversified, better economy. Yeah. And everything else that the government says around supply and everything, it's all window dressing.
Yeah.
The number one solution is to stop adding to the problem every year by adding hundreds of thousands of extra people that need housing infrastructure. It's very simple.
It is very simple. We say that often when you and I talk at this time. And, we did get the hope at the election that perhaps something might happen because it's just a no-brainer. And even if you go back, if you want to be generous and go back to before the pandemic, if you believe supply is the issue, you go back before the pandemic, the targets that the government have published now, this 1.2 million homes over 5 years, I think it is, that would have to be building homes at a rate we've never built homes in the history of Australia, whilst they say at the same time there's a labour shortage and the cost of building has gone through the roof. It is a fantasy. Or you could cut net overseas migration by 15%. Hello? Now, mate, do we have a champion or a clown this week?
It's a champion, mate.
Well, stand by. This is very, very, very good news because, we like to point out the wrongs, but we also like to reward the excellence. Who's the champion, mate?
Okay, so this week's champion is US energy expert Robert Bryce. So he's a US energy expert who's testified before the US Congress and on energy. He wrote for the Wall Street Journal. And, Robert Bryce has visited Australia and he's dropped some truth bombs in Australia's net zero fantasy, which he described as, quote, madness and reckless. So Bryce told 2GB's own Ben Fordham that Australia is a, quote, energy superpower, but we act like a, quote, energy weakling. Now, he like me, questioned why Australia exports, he says, 7 times more coal than it consumes, yet we are blowing up our coal plants. A very good question. He also questioned why we export many times more gas. So it's about 4 times more gas than we use locally, but we deny ourselves access to cheap and abundant gas. He also said that Australia's position on nuclear power is completely contradictory and that we are illogical to say yes to net zero and no to nuclear power when Australia holds nearly a third of the world's uranium reserves. And he likened Australia's energy policy stance to Saudi Arabia refusing to use its own oil, and he described us as the Saudi Arabia of the Southern Hemisphere. And he said, could you imagine a situation whereby the Saudis deny themselves the use of their own oil while they export it to the rest of the world, which is effectively what we're doing with coal and gas. And he also said that Australia's net zero ambitions are futile and won't make any difference to the global climate, but are going to come at a very high cost to our own residents. So he said that Australia's emissions have gone down from about 1.5% to 1% of the global total emissions. Meanwhile, China and India have gone to about 40% of total emissions, and their emissions are skyrocketing. So he basically said Australia should, quote, stop doing stupid things, such as shutting down coal plants prematurely, and that our power prices are skyrocketing, to the detriment of the poor and working class.
Yeah.
And of course, everyone knows that these views obviously mirror my own, so that's why I obviously support it. But my constant, ramblings are that Australia should give itself cheap and reliable energy by burning more of its coal at home and exporting a bit less. Same with gas.
Yep.
And guess what? The global climate would be no worse.
Yep.
And worse off, but we'd have cheap and abundant energy. It's just common sense.
It's just common sense. Great stuff, mate. Stay well. I'm having a couple of weeks break, but I'll talk to you on my return. And thanks for jumping on each week. We love your work, mate. Stay well.